Well, Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to this week's Morning Coffee and a Thought, brought to you by Wings of Faith Ministries here in Sarnia, Ontario. It's good to be with you. I've got my coffee here. I hope you have yours. First of all, this morning, I just want to take the opportunity to thank you for your support, especially over this last year. We have grown tremendously from about 20 to 30 subscribers to over 800. And so we really want to take the time, both Al and I, to appreciate your support in the last year. This morning, on this morning's thought, I want to talk about a phrase that Jesus uses addressing the religious authorities in Matthew chapter 23. He uses the phrase, "You strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel." We would probably say it today as you major in minors and you minor in the majors. But we want to talk about what all that means, what it meant at that time. Before we get to our thought, I want to remind you that Morning Coffee and a Thought can be seen every Friday at 1 p.m. on our YouTube channel and every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. on our Facebook page. Also, we want to remind you that Journey of Insight comes out every Wednesday morning on our YouTube channel around 10 o'clock in the morning. Also, if you have a prayer request, if you want to make a donation, or you want information concerning our ministry, you can reach out to us at wingsoffaithministries.ca. All right, let's get back to the thought. Matthew chapter 23. It's called the Seven Woes. And it's the last major talking narrative that Matthew will have in his gospel. Much like the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5 through 7, the seven woes have a preamble to them, about a 12-verse preamble, where Jesus will address both his disciples and the crowds surrounding him as he's teaching about the situation with the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, it's very possible, like the sermon, that Matthew has grouped a bunch of different sermons and remarks that Jesus had made in the last year of his ministry concerning the religious authorities and has grouped them all together here in Matthew chapter 23. And so, first of all, we have, as I said, the preamble. Now, in the preamble, Jesus starts out by saying, you have to do what the scribes and Pharisees tell you to do. In other words, their teaching from the Torah is to be obeyed because they sit in the seat of Moses. They are teaching from the Torah. And so he said, you must obey the teaching. But then he will go on to say, but don't copy their practices or their behavior because they're hypocrites. They're good at telling you what to do, but they're not so good at really doing it themselves. And we'll get into that in a little bit. Some of these practices involved outward behavior. In other words, everything that the religious authorities did were done so that others would recognize and notice them. So in other words, their ritual practices, like Sabbath day laws, food laws, social behaviors, feast days, all these outward behaviors were done explicitly so that other people would notice them doing it. They wanted to be, and they were basically, religious exhibitionists, wanting to show their piety, their outward righteousness, their meticulous behaviors, so that the public at large would notice them. They loved to be called rabbi by people as they would go in and sit in the synagogues. So everything they've done were all about recognition and status. And Christ was firmly against that type of behavior. He wanted his followers not to look at either recognition, outward recognition, or status, as did the scribes and Pharisees. So that becomes the preamble of his message. Listen to what they tell you, but do not practice their behaviors, or you too will become a bona fide hypocrite. Now, with that being said, I want to focus on one particular woe of the 7 woes Christ talks about, and that's number 4. Christ will say to them, you give a tenth of your dill, your mint, and your cumin. You're meticulous about doing that, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the Torah. You forgot about justice and the love of God and the care for the people. In other words, to summarize, they were following the law in a ritual way, but they had long lost the spirit or the intent of the law as it was laid out in the Torah. What was behind all the commandments of the law? So, when it came to tithing, when it came to food laws, when it came to Sabbath day regulations, when it came to sacrifices and feasts, the ritual side of it, these religious authorities were all over it and made sure that people could see their actions. They wanted to be recognized. What was missing from them was any care or real concern about the people. Let's break this down a little bit. From the time of Moses and the original Torah, down through the centuries of Israel's history, rabbis had added to the Torah an oral tradition. And this grew to be over 600 rules and regulations for life in Israel. The religious authorities, as Jesus would tie up these heavy loads and put them on other people's shoulders to obey, but really didn't care about the people who were under them, had no care or concern at all. In fact, as you read the Gospels, it becomes very clear that the religious authorities had no real respect for the people of Israel. There are times when they said the people are just cursed. They believed simply by outward observance and routine that somehow this was going to save them. But the real purpose of the law, love for God and love for each other, somehow had been totally missed by this group of people. Jesus says to them, you swallow a camel, but you strain out a gnat. In other words, they would meticulously wash their hands and arms before they ate, even though they were already clean. But yet they practiced absolutely no care or concern for their fellow man. They didn't care about justice. They didn't care about fairness. They didn't care about the poor. All they cared about was status and their religious exhibitionism. That's all that weighed on their minds. It was all about ritual and not about care or concern or the love of God. As we enter into this year, we as human beings find it very easy to settle into routines. Now, a lot of people will be making New Year's resolutions, trying to set up new routines for themselves. But in our relationship with Christ, it can become very easy to enter into simply forms and routines. And while that's all happening, our hearts can get very hard. We lose the fundamental aspects of the gospel, the love of God for the people around us, care and concern for others, because we end up simply focusing on routines and rituals, going to church, tithing, religious things, and all good things, but losing the more weightier matters of our faith, the love of God and the fruit of the Holy Spirit. That being shown to other people, not just religious observance. It's very easy with our human nature to settle into simple routines and going through the motions of being a Christian while losing our heart for God. Later in the book of Revelation, there's a church there in the city of Ephesus. John will address this church in a letter, telling them they believe all the right things. They're practicing their religion properly, but they lost their first love. And I believe what it means is their first love for God and their love for people. When we come to Christ, the first thing that happens to us is the Spirit of God, the Holy Spirit, and the love of God comes to us. Remember, God loved us before we ever loved him. And that love of God comes in our hearts simply to be expressed to those around us. That's a fundamental part of Christianity. Relationship and love for God and relationship and love for people. But sometimes, over the course of times, and sometimes we don't even notice it because it's so subtle, our beliefs, our religion, our walk with Christ can become routine and ritual rather than truly expressing the love of Christ. As we come into 2026, let's be mindful of our lives. Are we falling into rituals and routines and simply being performative? Or are we really carrying the love that God had for us and expressing it to those around us with care and concern? That's my thought this week. Listen, enjoy your coffee, and we'll see you again next week.